Old woman was evicted from her own home by her son, but what she did next left him begging for mercy and facing serious consequences. The sun peeked through the faded floral curtains of Mrs. Thompson's modest bedroom, casting a warm glow on her weathered face. At 72, Margaret Thompson still rose with the birds, a habit ingrained from decades of early mornings spent preparing breakfast for her family. She blinked away the remnants of sleep and slowly sat up, her joints creaking in protest. "Another day," she murmured to herself, a small smile playing on her lips. Despite the aches and pains that came with age, Mrs. Thompson always found reasons to be grateful. She shuffled to the bathroom, catching a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Silver hair framed a face etched with laugh lines and wisdom. Her blue eyes, though a bit cloudy now, still held a spark of vitality. Mrs. Thompson had never been one for vanity, but she took pride in her appearance, always making sure she looked presentable. After freshening up, she made her way downstairs, each step on the worn carpet bringing back memories of a house once filled with laughter and life. Now it was just her and the echoes of the past. In the kitchen, Mrs. Thompson went about her morning routine. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then reached for her favorite mug, a chipped thing with "World's Best Mom" printed on it, a gift from her son, Robert, many years ago. As she waited for the water to boil, Mrs. Thompson's gaze drifted to the refrigerator door, covered in fading photographs. There was Robert on his first day of school, gap-toothed and grinning. Another showed him at his high school graduation, standing proud in his cap and gown. And there in the center was a picture of the two of them, together at Robert's college graduation. "My boy," she whispered, her heart swelling with pride and a tinge of loneliness. Robert had moved to the city years ago, pursuing a career in finance. His visits had become increasingly rare, and their phone calls shorter and more infrequent. The whistle of the kettle snapped Mrs. Thompson out of her reverie. She prepared her tea and toast, then settled at the small kitchen table by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was coming to life. Mrs. Jenkins from next door was walking her yappy little dog, while Mr. Gonzalez across the street was retrieving his morning paper. As she sipped her tea, Mrs. Thompson's mind wandered to the day ahead. Tuesdays meant volunteer work at the local community center. She enjoyed spending time there, helping with the after-school programs and feeling useful. It gave her a sense of purpose, something to look forward to in her quiet life. The shrill ring of the telephone startled her. Setting down her mug, Mrs. Thompson hurried to answer it, her heart quickening. Could it be Robert? "Hello," she answered, trying to keep the hopeful tremor out of her voice. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Clara from the community center. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we've had a bit of an emergency. Is there any chance you could come in this morning to help with the food drive sorting?" Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of disappointment and relief. "Of course, dear. I'd be happy to help. I'll be there in an hour." After hanging up, she returned to the kitchen to finish her breakfast, her movements now more purposeful. She had always believed in the importance of giving back to her community, a value she had tried to instill in Robert as well. As she cleared away her dishes, Mrs. Thompson's eyes once again fell on the photographs on the fridge. She paused, her hand reaching out to touch the image of Robert's smiling face. "I wonder what you're up to today, sweetheart," she mused aloud. "I hope you're taking care of yourself." With a small sigh, Mrs. Thompson shook off the melancholy threatening to settle over her. She had a busy day ahead, and there were people counting on her. Straightening her shoulders, she headed upstairs to get dressed, determined to face the day with the same strength and grace she had always shown. As she buttoned up her favorite floral blouse, Mrs. Thompson caught sight of herself in the mirror once more. The woman looking back at her was not just a lonely old lady, but a pillar of her community, a friend to many, and a mother who had given her all to raise her son. With a nod of self-assurance, she grabbed her purse and headed out the door, ready to embrace whatever the day might bring. Little did Mrs. Thompson know that her world was about to be turned upside down, and the strength she had cultivated over a lifetime would soon be put to the ultimate test. Mrs. Thompson sat on the worn sofa in Clara's cozy living room, her hands trembling as she clutched a steaming mug of chamomile tea. The events of the past few days swirled in her mind like a turbulent storm, leaving her feeling adrift and disoriented. Clara, her kind-hearted neighbor, bustled about the kitchen, preparing a light dinner. The aroma of homemade soup wafted through the air, but Mrs. Thompson found she had little appetite. "Margaret," Clara called gently, emerging from the kitchen with a bowl of soup. "You need to eat something, dear. Keep your strength up." Mrs. Thompson nodded absently, accepting the bowl with a weak smile. "Thank you, Clara. I don't know what I'd do without you." Clara settled into the armchair across from her, concern etched on her face. "Have you heard anything more from Robert?" At the mention of her son's name, Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled with tears. She shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "No, nothing. It's as if I never existed to him." Clara reached out, patting Mrs. Thompson's knee comfortingly. "I'm sure he'll come around, Margaret. He can't just forget everything you've done for him." Mrs. Thompson stared into her soup, watching the steam rise in lazy spirals. "I keep trying to understand, Clara. Where did I go wrong? Was I not a good mother?" "Oh, Margaret, don't you dare think that!" Clara exclaimed, her voice firm. "You are an excellent mother. Robert's actions are his own responsibility, not yours." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Clara rose to answer it, returning moments later with a tall, distinguished-looking man in tow. "Margaret, this is Mr. Jameson. He's the lawyer I told you about," Clara introduced. Mr. Jameson stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, it's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Mrs. Thompson shook his hand weakly, feeling overwhelmed. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Jameson. I'm not sure what to do next." The lawyer settled into a chair, his expression compassionate but professional. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the documents you provided. I want you to know that what your son did, evicting you from your own home, it's not just morally reprehensible, it's legally questionable." A flicker of hope ignited in Mrs. Thompson's chest. "What do you mean?" Mr. Jameson leaned forward, his voice steady and reassuring. "The house was in your name, Mrs. Thompson. The transfer of ownership to your son seems to have been done under dubious circumstances. We may have grounds to challenge it." For the first time in days, Mrs. Thompson felt a spark of her old determination. "What do we need to do?" As Mr. Jameson outlined the potential legal steps, Mrs. Thompson found herself listening intently, her mind clearing of the fog of despair that had enveloped her since the eviction. "It won't be easy," Mr. Jameson cautioned, "and it might get complicated. Are you prepared for that, Mrs. Thompson?" She straightened her shoulders, a glimmer of her former self shining through. "Mr. Jameson, I've faced many challenges in my life. I never thought my own son would be one of them. But here we are. I'm ready to fight for what's right." Clara beamed at her friend's resurgence of spirit. "That's the Margaret I know." As the evening wore on, they discussed strategies and next steps. Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of emotions: sorrow at the broken relationship with her son, determination to reclaim her home, and gratitude for the support of her friends. When Mr. Jameson left, promising to begin work on her case immediately, Mrs. Thompson turned to Clara. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." Clara waved off her thanks. "That's what friends are for, Margaret. Now why don't you get some rest? Tomorrow's a new day and we've got work to do." As Mrs. Thompson prepared for bed in Clara's guest room, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was tired and hurt, but there was a new resolve in her eyes. She might have lost her home and her son's love, but she hadn't lost herself. Settling into bed, Mrs. Thompson's mind drifted to Robert. Despite everything, a part of her still longed to understand what had driven him to this point. As she drifted off to sleep, she made a silent promise to herself. She would fight for her home, but she would also seek to understand the changes in her son. Perhaps in unraveling that mystery, she might find a way to heal the rift between them. Little did Mrs. Thompson know that her quest for answers would lead her down a path she never expected, uncovering secrets that would shake her world to its very foundation. Mrs. Thompson stood at the window of Clara's guest room, watching the early morning light filter through the trees. She had barely slept, her mind a whirlwind of memories and questions. The weight of her new reality pressed heavily upon her shoulders, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. "Margaret? Are you awake?" Clara's gentle voice called. "Yes, dear." "Come in," Mrs. Thompson replied, turning from the window. Clara entered, carrying a tray with tea and toast. "I thought you might like some breakfast. How are you feeling this morning?" Mrs. Thompson managed a small smile. "Better, I think. Still confused and hurt, but stronger." As they sat together sipping tea, Clara broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Margaret, I've been thinking. We need to understand why Robert did this. There must be more to the story." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. My Robert, the boy I raised, he wouldn't do this without a reason. Something must have changed. Do you have any idea what might have triggered this?" Clara asked gently. Mrs. Thompson's brow furrowed in concentration. "He's been different lately, more distant. The last time he visited, about 6 months ago, he seemed nervous, distracted. When I asked if everything was all right, he brushed it off, said it was just work stress." Clara leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What exactly does Robert do now? I know he went into finance, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure," Mrs. Thompson admitted. "He used to talk about his work all the time, but lately he's been vague. Something about investments and high-profile clients." A moment of silence fell between them as they both pondered this information. Suddenly, Clara's eyes lit up. "Margaret, do you remember my nephew, Tom? He works in the financial sector in the city. Maybe he could discreetly look into Robert's business dealings?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated. The idea of investigating her own son felt wrong, but the need to understand overpowered her reservations. "Do you think he would, without raising any suspicions?" Clara nodded confidently. "Tom's a good boy, and he knows how to be discreet. I'll give him a call later today." As they finished their breakfast, Mr. Jameson arrived, his briefcase in hand and a determined look on his face. "Good morning, ladies. I hope you're ready for a busy day, Mrs. Thompson. We have a lot of ground to cover." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Mr. Jameson pored over documents, asking Mrs. Thompson detailed questions about the history of her home ownership and her financial arrangements with Robert. Clara busied herself making phone calls, reaching out to contacts who might be able to help. As the day wore on, Mrs. Thompson found herself feeling more energized than she had in days. The shock and despair were still there, lurking beneath the surface, but they were tempered by a growing sense of purpose. During a brief lull in the activity, Mrs. Thompson excused herself and stepped out into Clara's small backyard. The afternoon sun warmed her face as she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The scent of Clara's rose bushes filled the air, reminding her of her own garden back home. Home. The word brought a pang to her heart. Would she ever see her beloved house again? The thought of losing it forever was almost unbearable. "Mrs. Thompson?" Mr. Jameson's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, a strange expression on his face. "Is everything all right, Mr. Jameson?" she asked, noting the tension in his posture. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Thompson, I've just received some information that, well, it's rather concerning. It seems that your son's company has been flagged for some potentially irregular activities." Mrs. Thompson felt her heart drop. "What kind of activities?" Mr. Jameson's voice was gentle but firm. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but there are indications of possible financial improprieties. If this is true, it might explain your son's recent behavior." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Mrs. Thompson processed this information. Could her Robert be involved in something illegal? The very thought was almost too much to bear. As she stood there, struggling to come to terms with this new development, Clara appeared at the door. "Margaret, Tom's on the phone. He says he's found something you need to hear." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Whatever was coming, she would face it head on. With a nod to Mr. Jameson and a grateful smile to Clara, she walked back into the house, ready to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As she reached for the phone, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to embark on a journey that would change everything. Little did she know just how right she was. Mrs. Thompson's hand trembled as she held the phone to her ear, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. "Hello, Tom. This is Margaret Thompson." "Mrs. Thompson," Tom's voice crackled through the line, a mix of respect and concern evident in his tone. "I'm glad I could reach you. I've been looking into the situation as Aunt Clara requested, and, well, I've found some things that are quite troubling." She sank into a nearby chair, bracing herself. "Go on, Tom. I need to know." Tom cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, it appears that Robert's investment firm has been involved in some highly questionable practices. There are patterns of suspicious transactions, inconsistencies in their reported earnings, and, I hate to say this, but there are signs of potential fraud." The words hit Mrs. Thompson like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Are you certain, Tom?" "I can't be 100% sure without a full investigation, but the evidence I've found is compelling. Mrs. Thompson, I think your son might be in serious trouble." As Tom continued to explain his findings, Mrs. Thompson felt as if she were listening from underwater, the words muffled and distant. How could her Robert, the little boy she'd raised with such love and care, be involved in something like this? After thanking Tom and ending the call, Mrs. Thompson sat in stunned silence. Clara and Mr. Jameson, who had been waiting nearby, approached cautiously. "Margaret?" Clara's voice was soft with concern. "What did Tom say?" Slowly, Mrs. Thompson recounted what she'd learned. As she spoke, Mr. Jameson's expression grew increasingly grave. "Mrs. Thompson," he said when she'd finished, "if what Tom has uncovered is true, this changes everything. Your son's actions, the sudden eviction, the transfer of property, they might be attempts to protect assets in anticipation of legal trouble." Clara gasped. "You mean he used his own mother as a shield?" Mr. Jameson nodded solemnly. "It's a possibility we have to consider." Mrs. Thompson stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something to dispel the turmoil inside her. She paced the room, her mind racing. "I just can't believe it. There must be some mistake. My Robert wouldn't... He couldn't..." Clara moved to her friend's side, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "Margaret, I know this is hard to accept, but we need to face the facts. Robert's actions have already shown that he's not the man you thought he was." Mrs. Thompson turned to Mr. Jameson, a new determination in her eyes. "What do we do now?" The lawyer straightened, his professional demeanor taking over. "We need to act quickly. First, we'll file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further transfer or sale of your property. Then we'll need to gather more concrete evidence of Robert's activities." As they discussed the next steps, Mrs. Thompson felt a strange mix of emotions churning within her. There was sorrow, of course, and a deep sense of betrayal. But there was also anger, not just at Robert, but at herself for being so blind to what was happening. As the day wore on, Mrs. Thompson found herself retreating to Clara's guest room, needing a moment alone to process everything. She sat on the edge of the bed, her gaze falling on an old photo of Robert she'd managed to grab before leaving her home. It showed him at his college graduation, beaming with pride and promise. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, tracing his face with a trembling finger. What happened to you? Where did I go wrong?" A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara peeked in, her face etched with concern. "Margaret, Mr. Jameson is leaving. He wants to know if you have any questions before he goes." Mrs. Thompson straightened her shoulders, wiping away a stray tear. "Yes, I'll be right there." As she moved to join the others, Mrs. Thompson caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was tired and hurt, but there was a steely glint in her eye that hadn't been there before. She realized that despite the pain and confusion, a part of her was ready to fight, not just for her home, but for the truth. Rejoining Clara and Mr. Jameson, Mrs. Thompson felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Mr. Jameson," she said, her voice steady, "I want you to do whatever is necessary to uncover the truth. If my son has done something wrong, he needs to face the consequences. But," she paused, her voice softening slightly, "if there's any chance he's been misled or manipulated, I want to know that too." Mr. Jameson nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "We'll leave no stone unturned, Mrs. Thompson. You have my word." As Mr. Jameson left, promising to be in touch soon, Mrs. Thompson turned to Clara. "I never thought I'd be in this position, investigating my own son. But I raised him to be honest and responsible. If he's lost his way, I need to understand why." Clara squeezed her friend's hand. "You're doing the right thing, Margaret. Whatever happens, I'll be right here with you." Mrs. Thompson managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across Clara's living room, Mrs. Thompson steeled herself for the challenging days ahead. She didn't know what the investigation would uncover, but she was determined to face the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. Mrs. Thompson sat at Clara's kitchen table, a stack of documents spread out before her. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the papers that held the key to unraveling the mystery of her son's actions. She'd spent the past few days poring over bank statements, property records, and old correspondence, searching for any clue that might explain Robert's drastic change. Clara bustled about, preparing a pot of tea. "How's it going, Margaret? Any breakthroughs?" Mrs. Thompson sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "Nothing concrete yet, but there's definitely a pattern here. Robert's financial decisions became erratic about 2 years ago. Large sums moving in and out of accounts, investments in companies I've never heard of." As Clara set a steaming cup of tea beside her, the doorbell rang. Moments later, Mr. Jameson entered the kitchen, his face grave but determined. "Good morning, ladies," he said, taking a seat at the table. "I'm afraid I have some news, and it's not particularly good." Mrs. Thompson straightened, bracing herself. "What is it, Mr. Jameson?" The lawyer pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "I've been in touch with some contacts in the financial sector. It appears that Robert's firm is under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They suspect a complex scheme of embezzlement and fraud." The words hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart constrict, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What does this mean for Robert? For the case to reclaim my home?" Mr. Jameson leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "If the allegations are true, Robert could be facing serious legal consequences. As for your home, this actually strengthens our case. We can argue that the property transfer was part of an attempt to hide assets." Clara placed a comforting hand on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Thank you both for your support, but we need to focus on what to do next. Mr. Jameson, what are our options?" As the lawyer outlined their potential courses of action, Mrs. Thompson found her mind drifting to memories of Robert as a child. His first steps, his proud grin when he learned to ride a bike, the tears she'd wiped away after his first heartbreak. How had that sweet boy turned into a man capable of such deceit? A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Clara went to answer it, returning moments later with a puzzled expression. "Margaret, there's someone here to see you." Says his name is Daniel Foster. Do you know him? Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in recognition. Daniel? Robert's old college roommate? I haven't seen him in years. A tall man with kind eyes and graying hair stepped into the kitchen. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice filled with a mix of respect and hesitation. I'm sorry to intrude, but I heard about what happened. I think I might have some information that could help. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Daniel. Mrs. Thompson gestured for him to sit. Please, Daniel, tell us what you know. Daniel took a seat, his hands clasped tightly on the table. I've been working in the same industry as Robert for years. We've kept in touch, and lately he's been different, stressed. About 6 months ago, he called me late one night, sounding desperate. He talked about being in over his head, about powerful people putting pressure on him. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her heart racing. Did he say who these people were? What kind of pressure? Daniel shook his head. He didn't give specifics, but Mrs. Thompson, I got the impression that Robert might be involved in something he couldn't control, something dangerous. The implications of Daniel's words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Jameson was the first to break the silence. Mr. Foster, would you be willing to make an official statement about this conversation? Daniel nodded solemnly. Of course. I came here because I couldn't stand by and watch Robert destroy his life and hurt his mother in the process. Mrs. Thompson, I know Robert has done some terrible things, but I truly believe he might be a victim too. As the others discussed the legal implications of this new information, Mrs. Thompson found herself lost in thought. The possibility that Robert might be in danger added a new layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Despite everything, the maternal instinct to protect her child surged within her. Mr. Jameson, she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve, I want to proceed with reclaiming my home, but I also want to help Robert if he's truly in trouble. Is there a way we can do both? The lawyer considered for a moment. It won't be easy, Mrs. Thompson, but if we can prove that Robert acted under duress, it might mitigate his legal troubles while still allowing us to challenge the property transfer. As they began to formulate a new strategy, Mrs. Thompson felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was still uncertain and fraught with challenges, but for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like she had a purpose beyond just reclaiming her home. She was fighting for her son's future as well. Looking around at the supportive faces surrounding her, Mrs. Thompson realized that she wasn't alone in this fight. With their help, she would uncover the truth and, hopefully, find a way to save not just her home, but her son as well. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Mrs. Thompson. With Daniel Foster's revelation, the investigation took on a new urgency. Mr. Jameson had mobilized his team, digging deeper into Robert's business dealings and the mysterious, powerful people who might be pulling the strings. On a crisp morning, Mrs. Thompson found herself sitting in Mr. Jameson's office, surrounded by stacks of documents and computer printouts. The lawyer's face was etched with concern as he pored over the latest findings. Mrs. Thompson, he began, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, I'm afraid the situation is more complex than we initially thought. We've uncovered a web of shell companies and offshore accounts linked to Robert's firm. It appears he's been moving large sums of money for some very influential individuals. Mrs. Thompson's heart sank. Are you saying my son is knowingly involved in illegal activities? Mr. Jameson's expression softened. Not necessarily. Based on what we've found and Mr. Foster's statement, it's possible Robert started out unaware of the true nature of these transactions. He may have been manipulated or coerced into continuing once he realized what was happening. A mix of relief and worry washed over Mrs. Thompson. We need to tread carefully, Mr. Jameson advised. If Robert is indeed caught up in something dangerous, confronting him directly could put him at risk. I suggest we continue gathering evidence and prepare to present our findings to the proper authorities. As they discussed the next steps, Clara arrived at the office, her face flushed with excitement. "Margaret, I've just heard from Tom. He's found something big." Tom joined them via video call, his image flickering on Mr. Jameson's computer screen. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been analyzing the financial records we obtained, and I've identified a pattern. There's a recurring transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands. It's registered to a company called Nexus Enterprises." Mr. Jameson leaned forward, intrigued. "Nexus Enterprises? That name has come up in some other high-profile fraud cases I've heard about." Tom nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And here's the kicker. I've traced some of the funds from Nexus back to a local account, an account belonging to a man named Victor Blackwell." The name sent a chill down Mrs. Thompson's spine. Victor Blackwell? But that's Robert's mentor, the man who gave him his start in finance. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Could Robert's own mentor be behind his troubles? Mr. Jameson was the first to speak. "This is a significant lead. If we can prove Blackwell's involvement, it could change everything for Robert's case." As the group discussed strategies for pursuing this new lead, Mrs. Thompson felt a strange mix of emotions. There was hope that they might be closer to understanding Robert's actions, but also fear of what they might uncover. Later that evening, back at Clara's house, Mrs. Thompson sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Clara joined her, offering a steaming mug of tea. "How are you holding up, Margaret?" Clara asked gently. Mrs. Thompson sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. I'm not sure, Clara. Part of me is relieved that Robert might not be the mastermind behind all this. But another part still hurts because he didn't come to you for help," Clara finished softly. Mrs. Thompson nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Exactly. We were always so close. When did he stop trusting me?" Clara placed a comforting hand on her friend's arm. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Margaret. Robert's an adult, and he made his choices. What matters now is that you're fighting for him, even after everything that's happened." As they sat in companionable silence, Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, and the content made her blood run cold. "Stop digging. You don't know what you're getting into. For your own safety, let it go." With shaking hands, Mrs. Thompson showed the message to Clara, whose eyes widened in alarm. "We need to tell Mr. Jameson about this right away," Clara said, already reaching for her own phone. As Clara made the call, Mrs. Thompson stared at the ominous message on her screen. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt truly afraid. Not for herself, but for Robert. What had her son gotten himself into? The warm evening suddenly felt chilly, and Mrs. Thompson wrapped her arms around herself. She had always believed that the truth would set you free, but now she wondered, at what cost would this truth come? As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Mrs. Thompson steeled herself for what was to come. She had never backed down from a challenge before, and she wasn't about to start now. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them head-on, for Robert's sake and for her own. The following morning, Mrs. Thompson found herself in a secure conference room at Mr. Jameson's law firm. The atmosphere was tense as she sat surrounded by Mr. Jameson, 2 police detectives, and a representative from the SEC. The threatening text message had escalated their investigation to a new level of urgency and complexity. Detective Sarah Collins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, leaned forward. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your reluctance to involve law enforcement earlier, but I'm glad you've come to us now. This message is a clear attempt at intimidation, and we take that very seriously." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I just want to understand what's happening to my son. Is Robert in danger?" The SEC representative, a Mr. Harrison, cleared his throat. "Based on the evidence we've seen, it's possible that your son is caught in a complex financial fraud scheme. The involvement of Victor Blackwell and Nexus Enterprises suggests this goes beyond simple embezzlement." Mr. Jameson interjected. "What Mr. Harrison means, Mrs. Thompson, is that Robert might be what we call a fall guy, someone set up to take the blame if the illegal activities were discovered." The realization hit Mrs. Thompson like a physical blow. Her Robert, her boy, manipulated and used by people he trusted. The anger she had been suppressing began to bubble to the surface. Detective Collins must have sensed her distress. "Mrs. Thompson, I know this is difficult, but we need your help. Can you think of any recent changes in Robert's behavior? Any new acquaintances or unusual activities?" Mrs. Thompson closed her eyes, thinking back. He became more distant about 2 years ago, stopped visiting as often, always seemed distracted when we talked, and there was a business trip to the Cayman Islands last year. He'd never traveled there before. Mr. Harrison perked up at this. "The Caymans? That aligns with the timeline of some suspicious transactions we've been tracking." As the group discussed the implications of this new information, Mrs. Thompson's mind wandered to happier times. Robert's college graduation, his first job offer, the pride in his eyes when he told her about his promotion. How had it all gone so wrong? Her reverie was interrupted by a commotion outside the conference room. Moments later, Clara burst in, her face flushed with excitement. "Margaret!" "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this couldn't wait. Tom's found something huge." With permission from the detectives, Tom was patched in via video call. His image appeared on a large screen, his excitement palpable even through the digital connection. "Mrs. Thompson, everyone, I've been digging deeper into Nexus Enterprises, and I've uncovered a trail of emails. They're encrypted, but I managed to crack a few. There's clear evidence of coercion, threats made against Robert, and you, Mrs. Thompson." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Detective Collins was the first to speak. "This changes things. If we can prove Robert acted under duress, it could significantly alter his legal situation." Mr. Jameson turned to Mrs. Thompson, his expression grave but hopeful. "This is the break we've been looking for. With this evidence, we can not only work on clearing Robert's name, but also go after the real culprits." As the professionals in the room began to strategize, Mrs. Thompson felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. There was relief that Robert might not be the willing participant she had feared, but also a deep sadness for the fear and isolation he must have experienced. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Collins answered, her tone gentle but firm. "Now, Mrs. Thompson, we set a trap. We'll use the information we have to lure out the people behind this scheme. But I want to be clear, this could be dangerous. We'll need to place you under protection." Mrs. Thompson straightened her shoulders, a newfound determination in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to help my son and bring these people to justice." As the meeting concluded and plans were set in motion, Mrs. Thompson found herself standing by the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there was Robert, caught in a web of deceit and fear. She silently vowed to do whatever it took to bring him home safely. Clara approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You okay, Margaret?" Mrs. Thompson turned to her friend, a small smile on her lips. "I will be, Clara. For the first time in a long while, I feel like we're making progress. Robert needs me now more than ever, and I won't let him down." As they left the law firm, escorted by plainclothes officers to a safe house, Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of apprehension and hope. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Her son's future and her own depended on it. The safe house was a modest suburban home, unremarkable from the outside but equipped with state-of-the-art security systems. Mrs. Thompson sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea growing cold before her. Detective Collins paced nearby, speaking in hushed tones on her phone. It had been 3 days since the meeting at Mr. Jameson's office, and the plan to draw out the real culprits was in full swing. Mrs. Thompson had played her part, making carefully scripted phone calls and sending emails that hinted at her knowledge of the situation. Now they waited. Clara, who had insisted on staying with her friend despite the potential danger, bustled about the kitchen preparing a light lunch. "You need to eat something, Margaret," she urged gently. Mrs. Thompson nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. "I keep thinking about Robert. Where is he? Is he safe?" Detective Collins ended her call and approached the table. "We're doing everything we can to locate your son, Mrs. Thompson. The good news is our bait seems to be working. We've detected increased activity around some of the accounts we're monitoring." Just then, Mr. Jameson arrived, his face a mix of excitement and concern. "We've had a breakthrough," he announced without preamble. "One of our contacts in the financial sector has come forward with information about an upcoming meeting. Apparently, Victor Blackwell is planning to meet with some of his associates to discuss damage control." Mrs. Thompson's heart raced. "And Robert, will he be there?" Mr. Jameson shook his head. "We don't know for certain, but it's unlikely. However, this meeting could provide us with the evidence we need to bring down the entire operation and clear Robert's name." As the group discussed the implications of this new development, Mrs. Thompson found her thoughts drifting to her son. She recalled a conversation they'd had years ago when Robert was just starting his career in finance. "Mom," he had said, his eyes shining with ambition, "I'm going to make you proud. I'll build something great, something that will secure our future." At the time, she had been touched by his determination. Now those words took on a painful new meaning. Had that ambition, that desire to prove himself, led him down this dangerous path? Her reverie was interrupted by a commotion at the front door. Moments later, Tom burst into the kitchen, out of breath and clutching a laptop. "I've got it!" he exclaimed. "I've cracked the encryption on the rest of those emails. You won't believe what I've found." As Tom set up his laptop, the others gathered around. On the screen, a series of emails appeared, detailing the intricate web of fraud and manipulation that had ensnared Robert. "Look here," Tom pointed to one particular message. "This is from Blackwell to one of his associates. He's talking about using Robert as a necessary sacrifice if things go south." Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine. "They were planning to frame him all along," she whispered. Detective Collins leaned in, her eyes scanning the emails rapidly. "This is exactly what we needed. With this evidence, we can move on Blackwell and his associates. And more importantly, we can prove that Robert was coerced." As the detective stepped away to make some calls, Mr. Jameson turned to Mrs. Thompson, his expression softening. "Mrs. Thompson, I know this has been an ordeal, but we're close to resolving this. Once we apprehend Blackwell and his group, we can work on locating Robert and bringing him home safely." Mrs. Thompson nodded, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over her. "What happens then? Will Robert face any charges?" Mr. Jameson sighed. "It's complicated. He may have to answer for some of his actions, but with this evidence of coercion, we have a strong case for leniency. The important thing is that he'll be safe, and the real criminals will face justice." As the group continued to discuss their next steps, Mrs. Thompson found herself drawn to the window. Outside, the world seemed deceptively normal. Neighbors walking their dogs, children playing in nearby yards. Yet here she was, in the middle of a story that seemed more suited to a crime novel than her quiet life. Clara joined her at the window, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Mrs. Thompson managed a small smile. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. A few weeks ago, my biggest worry was whether I'd planted my tomatoes too early. Now," Clara squeezed her shoulder, "now you're taking on a group of financial criminals to save your son. Margaret Thompson, you are the strongest person I know." As the afternoon wore on, plans were made and strategies refined. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, determined to understand every aspect of what was to come. She knew that the next few days would be crucial, not just for bringing the criminals to justice, but for reuniting with her son. That night, as she lay in bed in the unfamiliar safe house, Mrs. Thompson whispered a quiet prayer. "Robert, wherever you are, please be safe. We're coming for you, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer." With that thought, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and the echo of her son's voice calling out for help. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the safe house's living room as Mrs. Thompson paced nervously. Today was the day they would put their plan into action. Detective Collins and her team were preparing to raid the meeting where Victor Blackwell and his associates would be gathering. Mr. Jameson entered the room, his usual composed demeanor tinged with tension. "Mrs. Thompson, I've just received word from our contacts. The meeting is confirmed for noon at an office building downtown. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life, Mr. Jameson. What do I need to do?" As Mr. Jameson outlined her role one last time, Clara bustled in with a tray of tea and toast. "You need to keep up your strength, Margaret," she insisted, her own voice betraying her anxiety. Mrs. Thompson managed a small smile for her friend. "Thank you, Clara. I don't know what I'd do without you." The hours ticked by slowly as final preparations were made. Mrs. Thompson found herself lost in thought, remembering the day Robert had announced his partnership with Victor Blackwell. He had been so excited, so full of hope for the future. How could they have known then that it would lead to this? At precisely 11:30 a.m., Detective Collins entered the room, her face a mask of professional calm. "It's time, Mrs. Thompson. Are you ready?" Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Thompson stood. "Yes, I'm ready." The plan was simple but risky. Mrs. Thompson would place a call to Victor Blackwell's office, pretending to have damaging information she was willing to sell. The call would be traced, providing the final piece of evidence needed for the raid. With shaking hands, Mrs. Thompson dialed the number. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Blackwell speaking." Summoning all her courage, Mrs. Thompson spoke, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mr. Blackwell, you don't know me, but I have information about your dealings with Nexus Enterprises. Information I'm sure you'd rather keep private." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Blackwell spoke again, his voice was cold. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "Let's just say I'm someone who knows too much," Mrs. Thompson continued, following the script they had prepared. "I'm willing to keep quiet for a price." As the conversation continued, Mrs. Thompson could see Detective Collins nodding approvingly. The trace was working, and Blackwell was taking the bait. Suddenly, Blackwell's tone changed. "Wait a minute. Thompson? Are you related to Robert Thompson?" Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat, but she pressed on. "That's not important. What matters is what I know, and what I'm willing to do with that information." The line went silent for a moment, then Blackwell's voice returned, now laced with barely contained anger. "You're making a big mistake, Mrs. Thompson. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Mrs. Thompson looked up at Detective Collins, her eyes wide. "Did we get what we needed?" The detective nodded, already moving towards the door. "We got it. The team is moving in now." "You did great, Mrs. Thompson." The next hour was a blur of activity. Reports came in of the successful raid, of arrests being made. Mrs. Thompson sat on the couch, Clara's comforting arm around her shoulders, as they waited for news about Robert. Finally, Mr. Jameson burst into the room, his face flushed with excitement. "We found him! Robert's safe. He was being held in a private residence outside the city. The police are bringing him in now." Mrs. Thompson felt her knees go weak with relief. "He's safe? Oh, thank God. When can I see him?" "Soon," Mr. Jameson assured her. "He needs to be debriefed first, but I promise you'll be reunited today." As the reality of the situation sank in, Mrs. Thompson found herself overwhelmed with emotion. Tears of relief and joy streamed down her face as Clara hugged her tightly. "You did it, Margaret," Clara whispered. "You saved your son." Mrs. Thompson shook her head. We did it. All of us together. As the day wore on, more details emerged. Victor Blackwell and his associates were in custody, facing numerous charges. The evidence gathered, including Robert's testimony, painted a picture of a vast financial fraud scheme that had ensnared many unwitting participants. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the safe house windows, Mrs. Thompson stood by the window, her heart full of conflicting emotions. Joy at Robert's safety, anger at those who had manipulated him, and a deep, abiding love for the son she had never stopped believing in. A gentle knock at the door made her turn. Detective Collins stood there, a small smile on her face. Mrs. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. And there, looking tired and disheveled but blessedly alive, stood Robert. For a moment, mother and son simply stared at each other, years of misunderstanding and pain hanging between them. Then, with a choked sob, Robert stepped forward. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. For everything." Mrs. Thompson didn't hesitate. She crossed the room and enveloped her son in a fierce embrace, tears flowing freely. "Oh, Robert, my boy, you're home now. You're safe." As they held each other, Mrs. Thompson knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be legal battles to face, trust to rebuild, and wounds to heal. But in that moment, with her son safely in her arms, she knew that they would face whatever came next together. The nightmare was over. A new chapter was about to begin. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Mrs. Thompson had been reunited with her son. The autumn leaves were turning golden outside her kitchen window as she prepared a pot of tea, a sense of peace settling over her that had been absent for so long. Robert sat at the kitchen table, poring over legal documents. The past months had been a whirlwind of court appearances, testimonies, and negotiations. Thanks to his cooperation and the evidence of coercion, Robert had been granted leniency. He was serving community service and had agreed to assist in the prosecution of Victor Blackwell and his associates. "More tea, sweetheart?" Mrs. Thompson asked, placing a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. Robert looked up, a small smile on his face. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." As they sat together, enjoying the quiet moment, the doorbell rang. Clara's cheerful voice called out, "Margaret, it's us!" Mrs. Thompson opened the door to find Clara, Mr. Jameson, and Detective Collins on her doorstep, all wearing warm smiles. "We thought we'd stop by to see how you're both doing," Mr. Jameson said as they entered. Over tea and Clara's homemade cookies, the group that had become like family discussed the latest developments. Victor Blackwell had been sentenced to 20 years in prison, his criminal empire dismantled. The investigation had led to reforms in the financial sector, with new safeguards put in place to prevent similar schemes. "You should be proud, Mrs. Thompson," Detective Collins said warmly. "Your courage helped bring down a major criminal operation." Mrs. Thompson shook her head modestly. "I just did what any mother would do for her child." As the afternoon wore on, Robert excused himself to make a phone call. When he returned, his face was alight with excitement. "Mom, I've got some news," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Remember that community center where you used to volunteer? They're looking for someone to teach financial literacy classes. I thought maybe I could do it. Use what I've learned to help others avoid the mistakes I made." Mrs. Thompson felt her heart swell with pride. "Oh, Robert, that's wonderful. I think it's a perfect idea." As their friends prepared to leave, each offering warm hugs and words of encouragement, Mrs. Thompson found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. She had faced the darkest of times, but had emerged stronger, with a renewed relationship with her son and a circle of friends who had become family. Standing in the doorway, waving goodbye to Clara, Mr. Jameson, and Detective Collins, Mrs. Thompson felt Robert's arm slip around her shoulders. "Mom," he said softly, "I know I can never fully make up for what I put you through, but I promise from now on, I'll always strive to be the son you deserve." Mrs. Thompson leaned into her son's embrace, her heart full. The journey had been long and difficult, but as she looked towards the future, she knew that the best was yet to come. Together, they would build a new life, one founded on honesty, love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.